Good evening. My name is Michelle Dujardin. Welcome to our forum. While I do work for Johns Hopkins All Children's, I'm here tonight as a mother, so that kind of changes my perspective of this event. I have 4 school-age children, 1 in high school, 1 in middle school, and 2 in elementary school. When these school-place shootings occur, I find myself going through the gamut of emotions: shock, anger, sadness, fear. Having children only magnifies all those emotions, as I'm sure you all realize. And as I'm trying to process these emotions, I'm also trying to ensure my children are able to process theirs, which leads to a litany of questions. How much discussion is too much? I'm sure they're being inundated at school, social media, the news. How much do I keep encouraging them to talk? Where's that line between too much and just enough? How do I ease their fear when I'm filled with my own fear? How do I stress that they need to feel comfortable if they see something to say something? So as my husband and I were working through these questions and having discussions with our children about the shooting in Parkland, my 16-year-old shows us the threats that were going around on Snapchat, which consisted of a picture of a teen holding a gun saying, "Get ready for round 2, Florida." For my 16-year-old son to make me aware of this leads me to believe he does have a little anxiety, although he followed it up with, "But I have a lot to do at school tomorrow, so I need to go." While we were fairly certain these were probably not legitimate threats, how as a parent do you deal with that? Was it worth the risk of sending our kids to school if there was even a teeny tiny possibility that these were legitimate? As a parent, it becomes overwhelming. Our only goal is to keep our children happy and healthy. And if my stress and anxiety and fear are at this level, what are my children's? How much fear, stress, and anxiety must they be going through? I began developing a list of questions because I am lucky enough to have access to a wonderful mental health care team that could help me work through how to not only deal with my anxiety, but also the anxiety of my children. And at this time, it became a thought that if I'm having all these questions and all these concerns, every other parent must be also. And now we're here. So in your packets and at the table are index cards. We're going to have speakers come up. Members of our mental health care team, members of our adolescent medicine department are going to come up and give brief little talks. And then at the end, we're going to have an open forum. And we want y'all to feel free to ask any questions you would like. If you don't feel comfortable to come up and talk, please write your question on the index card. We'll come around and get those from you. Those who are going to ask questions and talk, please make sure you speak into the microphone. We are videotaping this session, and we will be putting it on the website in the next 24 hours. So please make sure you speak into the microphone so we can pick up everything you say. We will at some point, I forgot how long she told me, have it where you can see the individual talks and sections also. We welcome you here tonight. I hope this helps everyone here. I hope it helps me. I hope it helps my son. I have brought one of my children, the oldest. So we want to help relieve some of your anxiety. So please, let us know what your questions are. Let us see if we can help you. So I'm going to introduce Jennifer Katzenstein. She's the Director of Psychology and Neuropsychology, to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We really appreciate the thoughtfulness of Michelle's idea and also the opportunity to speak with you all tonight so that we can be a part of how we recover from trauma that we've experienced in terms of these violent outbursts, as well as how we move forward with our families and with our children. It's my pleasure to first introduce Dr. Kristen Hoffman. She is our Director of Trauma Psychology here at Johns Hopkins All Children's. She specializes in program development, assessment and treatment of childhood traumatic stress and child disruptive behavior disorders, dissemination of evidence-based practices for childhood trauma, and development of trauma-informed child welfare systems. Her research interests include evaluation of factors impacting use and effectiveness of trauma-informed programs and interventions. Welcome, Dr. Hoffman.
Oh, thank you. I haven't even done anything yet. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes or so, I am going to talk about the impact of traumatic events on children as well as parents, and what to do and say to your children in the aftermath of tragedies such as the shooting in Parkland. Unfortunately, in today's world, it's not always possible to shield our children from tragedies, disasters, and other traumas that occur, no matter how hard as parents we work to keep our kids safe. Children may not personally experience these types of events firsthand, but they are being exposed to them through media, through other people, and even at schools where kids as young as 4 and 5 are having active shooter drills. It's just unbelievable. Being a parent myself, I know it's impossible not to be worried about our kids when they're away from us. So it's totally normal and natural following events like Parkland to be worried as a parent, to be anxious about sending your kids back to school and kind of disheartened about the violence that's going on in the world. As a psychologist who specializes in working with children who have experienced trauma, my first piece of advice to caregivers and parents is usually take care of yourself so that you can take care of your children. Our kids, no matter how old they are, typically go to parents in times of stress. Young kids and even older kids are looking to their parents when traumatic events happen or things that are uncertain happen. They're looking at their parents' reactions to try and figure out how they should be reacting. So because they often mirror their parents' reactions and demeanor, that means that us as parents have to be very good models of how to manage stress and manage our anxiety following these types of events. So as a parent, when you first hear about these tragedies, try and have your first initial responses of shock or helplessness or whatever emotions you're going through, try and have those away from your children if at all possible. It's okay to show our children emotions, but we don't want them necessarily seeing those really intense emotions from us. So my advice is initially have those away from them. Give yourself some time to process your feelings. Reach out to your support system so that you can be calm and regulated when you talk with your children. We're lucky that later tonight Dr. Katzenstein is going to talk to us about how to manage our anxieties as parents so that we can be healthy and present for our kids when we have to discuss difficult topics. When the world around us is dangerous or unpredictable, home really needs to be the safe haven for people. So in the aftermath of tragedies, it's important to keep schedules, routines, and typical family events that you usually would have. Those kind of restore some sense of security and normalcy. As parents, try and spend more time with your kids in the aftermath of tragic events. That builds just great relationships, but it also gives them more opportunity to ask questions and open up. Talking to children about their worries and concerns is really the first step in helping them cope with events that are going on and helping them to feel safe. So what you say and how you say it definitely matters, given kids' age and developmental level. So 7 and 8-year-olds don't need to know things in the same way that 16 and 17-year-olds do. So next I'm going to go through different kind of developmental stages and give you some ideas about how to talk to kids of different ages. For our preschoolers, so generally between the ages of 2 and 5, they don't necessarily need to know about these types of events going on if they're not going to hear about it otherwise. They really don't. So at that age, they should be focusing on stranger danger and personal safety types of things, and introducing all these other possible traumatic events that happen in the world may scare them unnecessarily. Obviously, if your child, your preschooler, has heard about these types of events or is at risk for hearing about them, talk to them. I'm not saying don't, but if they're at risk, definitely talk to them. But with preschoolers, you want to keep what you say very simple and limit it to about 1 or 2 sentences. So, for example, in relation to the Parkland shooting, you could say something like, a very bad man felt very angry and hurt some people. It's likely that preschoolers are going to be very confused as to why someone would hurt all those people. And so it's okay to talk to them about how this bad man is caught by the police and locked up and can't hurt anybody else right now. And I always tell parents to try to counteract these negative emotions and discussions with more positive ones. So with a preschooler, I would probably then go on and say, but did you hear about all of those really brave policemen and teachers that rush to keep kids safe? Let's talk about those and what those professionals do. Children 6 and up are more likely to have heard about events that have happened from their friends, from social media, from all different types of sources. So definitely go and have a conversation with your older kids if they're not bringing it up to you. If we don't talk to our kids about these things happening in the world or difficult events, they may let their imaginations run wild and overestimate or over-dramatize what's happening. On the other hand, they may also get the message that these are things we shouldn't talk about or that you don't know what's going on in the world, and that's definitely not what we want our kids thinking. It's always a good idea to practice in your head ahead of time what you want to say to your children, or practice with someone else, like a partner or a friend, so that you're very clear in the message you want to send your kids. Think about what you want your kids to take away from the conversation and try and focus your discussions with them on that. For kids that are between the ages of about 6 and 12, so our school-age kids, you definitely want to go and have a conversation with them about these tough events. And you could approach them by saying, did you hear about that shooting that happened at that school in Florida? What do you know? What questions do you have? For school-age children, we really want them to be leading the conversation with their questions, because then when we do that, they're kind of the gatekeepers of how much information they want to hear and what they're able to take in. So kind of follow your kids' lead. Letting them ask questions and be in charge also lets you know what they're thinking and can help you clear up any misbeliefs about what happened, such as the event's still going on or it happened right down the street. I will admit, when you let kids be in the lead and ask questions, they're probably going to ask you some difficult things, like, can this happen to me? Or can this happen to you at work? Or can this happen to my sister? In those instances, I would say just recognize that the underlying theme and message of those questions is usually, am I safe? So it's okay to talk to them about how these events are really rare, about how there's more good people out there in the world than there are bad, and how there's lots of people out there that are working to try and keep them safe. Also, I would say for kids this age, definitely point out or acknowledge and validate their feelings. So say things like, I understand how you're scared to go back to school. I'm a little worried too. Let's talk about what we can do to help you feel safe when you go back. For kids of all ages in the aftermath of tragedy, it's a good idea to limit their media exposure. What we see stays with us longer than what we hear. And there's research to show that repeated exposure to violent images, especially realistic images like that are being shown on news, can be damaging, more damaging. So we just want to limit that. And again, if they have seen something that's been disturbing to them, try and counteract those images with more positive ones. So show videos of helpers that came in and rescued people. So for our teenagers, you would approach a conversation in much the same way, but with them, you really want to know where they're getting their information and what their friends are saying. Go with them onto social media. Go with them to their Facebook pages, their Instagram, whatever else is. There's probably lots of other stuff out there I don't know about, but go with them to those pages and look at what they're looking at. Find out where they're getting their information. And that gives you an opportunity to clarify things, to ask about their thoughts and feelings. It's possible that our teenagers may express opinions that differ from our own as parents. And if they do, when events like this happen, things tend to get politically charged. If your teenager does express an opinion different than yours, it's okay. Just agree to disagree, move on. But we want to make sure that they feel comfortable going and talking to you. Teenagers, especially this current generation of teenagers, really tends to believe in social justice and collaboration. I think we're seeing that with those incredibly brave students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School and their gun control efforts and rallies. they are getting involved and trying to make a difference. And those are all really good things for building resilience and helping kids cope after traumatic events. So if you feel like your child or your teenager really has been impacted by what's happened, help them get involved in community events. Help them get involved in charities so that they feel like they're making a difference, however you feel comfortable doing that. Despite our concerns as parents about the emotional impact of these types of events on kids, it's important to know that common reactions after tragedy usually diminish over time. So it's common when kids hear about these types of events happening to be a little bit more worried about their own safety or their parents' safety, to maybe have some trouble sleeping or eating, or to have more trouble concentrating in school. And we really would expect those types of symptoms to go down after a few weeks. If they don't, and you notice prolonged trouble with eating or sleeping, more somatic symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, more acting out behaviors or high-risk behaviors, more withdrawal from events and people that they used to enjoy, then it's probably a good idea to reach out to a mental health professional for more assessment and more help. And I would also say that if your child has personally experienced a trauma firsthand or has witnessed a trauma firsthand, there is really good help out there. And the sooner we get kids into the right services, the better outcomes we see. So where do we go from here? We are about 2 weeks out from the events that happened in Parkland, and many of you have probably already talked to your kids about what's happened. If you haven't, it's a great idea to go back and do so, especially if you have teenagers. But I would encourage our children in the future to report any signs or symptoms of anything concerning in friends or anything they see on social media. They need to be comfortable going to parents and other adults like teachers and talking about those things. Spending more time with our kids away from screens is a really great idea. Make sure that you as a family have a safety plan so you know what to do in case of an emergency and write that down. And especially with our younger children, telling them that when an emergency happens or something scary happens, that they need to listen to the people who are in charge and follow those directions. So my time is up. And I want to end on a hopeful message because this is some really difficult stuff. And here's my hopeful message. Hopefully it puts you at a little bit of comfort. So we may not be able to prevent bad things from happening to our kids, but with the right support from adults around them, most of them really end up being okay. Over time, most children really do go back. They bounce back, and they're pretty resilient, especially if they have loving, caring parents who spend their Monday nights coming to events like this to learn how to support them better. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. It's my pleasure to next introduce Dr. Melissa Faith. She's a board-certified pediatric psychologist who specializes in evidence-based interventions to improve patient and family adjustment and adherence to pediatric blood and cancer disorder regimens, as well as having specific research interests in emotional socialization, parent coping and parenting, sibling adjustment, peer victimization, and dissemination of evidence-based interventions. She'll be speaking with us about cyberbullying and how to help your child respond to peers. Let's welcome Dr. Faith.
So when we were approached with the option of engaging in this talk tonight and talking to all of you to help you as best we can, we all were sort of searching our own wheelhouse for what it is we know a lot about that might be able to help you. And one of the things I've done a lot of my past research and some current research efforts on is peer victimization, the ways that kids are integrated into the social fabric of their schools and communities or not. And I thought that might be a really good place to start. I want to preface my talk by saying that a lot of us are looking for reasons why. We want to know why what happened did. We want to know what could have been prevented. And I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that all children who are bullied, who are even chronically bullied over time, are at risk of things that are very, very dangerous in school. It's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that for every single student to be safe at school, we would benefit from making sure that every student feels safe at school and truly is safe at school. So I'm going to talk to you today about social exclusion and how not being a part of the social fabric of the school and community around a child can put them at risk for all kinds of things down the road. What I'm going to talk a lot about tonight is something called peer victimization. We all know the word bullying, we've heard that, and oftentimes we'll hear the rhetoric, well, when I was a kid I was bullied, and I'm okay, so bullying must not be that big of a deal. And there's some truth in that. It turns out that 75% of kids from some time during kindergarten through 12th grade will be bullied. I'm not so worried about those kids. Most of them turn out just fine, no big deal. Who I am worried about are the 10 to 20% of children who are chronically bullied for at least 2 school semesters or more. And I'm interested in those kids where the bullying is characterized by 3 components. Number 1, a real power differential between that child and their aggressor. Number 2, the bullying being repeated and chronic. It never lets up. It happens day after day. And number 3, that there is a socially sanctioned aspect to the bullying, where it's not just one child bullying against another, but it is actually an entire social caste system that maintains that victim status. So there may be bullies who are instigating, but there are also bystanders who might be participating, and bystanders who are just watching. There may be people who are adamantly opposed to the bullying, but are watching and are too scared to do anything or say anything. The children who are victims of that kind of bullying are the ones that I'm most concerned about. When we're thinking about bullying, we really like to know what happens to these kids once they become chronic victims. And there are generally 4 categories of things that are outcomes. One are academic and career concerns. So youth who are chronically bullied are less likely to graduate high school, less likely to go to college and graduate, and less likely to attain as high of a career placement. There are also things related to their health status. And so we find that children who are chronically bullied tend to have poorer health outcomes over time. They also have greater presentation of somatic or body complaints. And so whether it is some sort of a physical condition they already have getting worse, or new complaints of headache, of stomachache, of things of that nature. Then there are concerns of the psychological category. Concerns about things like internalizing problems. And what I mean by that is depression, anxiety, social anxiety, feeling like it is very, very scary to even reach out and try to make a friend, to try to become integrated into the social context. There are also problems that we as psychologists call externalizing. This is fighting back, hitting, kicking, yelling, not wanting to lie down and be a victim. All those things put kids at risk long term. And then there's the category of psychological issues that sometimes stem from chronic peer victimization that are even scarier. Things like suicide, things like aggression. Very real concerns that we need to protect our chronic victims from. The problem that happens sometimes is that the relationship between mental health and bullying goes both ways. Kids who are bullied are more likely to have psychological problems down the road. But it is also the case that children who are suffering from mental health concerns are more likely to be bullied. And so we find that it's this vicious cycle where these children get trapped in this victim role and they cannot swim against the current. There's just no way they're going to get out of that riptide. You know, it's interesting. People who know me well know that I have lots of hobbies. One of my hobbies happens to be that I teach ballet on the side. And so I was talking to some of my students back in Texas where I used to work, and talking to them about another student who was an integrated part of our team who had a suicide attempt. And most of the kids I taught were very supportive. And they said, we want to know what to do to help. How do we help this child feel more involved in our team? What do we do? But then there was one student who spoke out, and she was very brave because her opinion was different than some of those that were being verbalized. But she said, in a very proud manner, I don't know if I can be friends with that person anymore. I feel like my mom's always talked to me about it. My family always agrees that I should stay away from people who are negative. I should stay away from people who are really challenged with things like that my friends define who I am. And as a psychologist, my psychologist hat comes back on, and I was taken aback. Not because the opinion is unusual, it's not. There's lots of stigma around mental health, but instead because the student was brave enough to say it out loud and gave us a chance to talk about it as a group, about what stigma of mental health really means. It means it's scary to get help. It means that if you see another child suffering, it's scary to say something. It's scary to know what to say. Who do you say it to? What do I do? You know, it's one thing to be in a classroom and see that one child is bullied or that one child has mental health problems. It's another to feel like you are in a position of social power to be able to stand up against that or to help that student get help, especially when you know that intervening might put you at risk of getting bullied as well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some kinds of bullying, how we recognize it, and then what we can do about it. Most of us are familiar with the three classic types of bullying. There's physical bullying, hitting, kicking, stealing lunch money. Verbal bullying, this is calling names, teasing. Relational bullying, you probably haven't heard that term before, but you probably have seen the movie Mean Girls, and that's what relational bullying is, where you're spreading rumors, you're leaving children out of activities on purpose. But then there's a newer type of bullying, one that has become so woven into our social fabric that it's become normal, and that's cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is new and different and scary in a lot of ways. One way that it's different is that cyberbullies often can remain anonymous. We don't know who these kids are, and even if we had a way to find out, we don't really have the resources to invest in doing that. Because of that, bullies have fewer consequences, and so they're emboldened to say things that they might not otherwise say. You know, we don't go up to the grocery store, the person in front of us in line, and rip into them for how they look, for what they're doing, even their parenting practices, although we feel very strongly about those things. Online, it's a different story. We don't have to have a face to that screen name. We're able to say things that we wouldn't otherwise say. Cyberbullying is also really problematic because it can happen in so many ways and outside of parents' awareness. You know, your kids might not tell you if they're being bullied online because they're scared you're going to limit their access, appropriately so, or they're worried that there could be consequences, that perhaps they were accessing social media or websites that they shouldn't have been accessing. Again, rightfully so, but they'd be concerned about that. Cyberbullying takes a number of forms. One form can be children creating hate websites against one child. As a parent, please know that this is very real, and I see it a lot in my clinical work. It can be where the child is invited to see the hate website. The child might not be aware of the hate website. It can go as far as telling somebody that they should commit suicide, that they should die. Cyberbullying can also take the form of somebody pretending to be somebody else. So pretending to be perhaps one of your children's friends and saying mean things, or pretending to be your child and saying things your child would not otherwise say. And then there's the category of cyberbullying that involves things like text message and Snapchat and photo sharing and that sort of thing, where perhaps things that your child would not want shared get shared among a large group of people. Cyberbullying's tough. There are a couple things you can do, though. In terms of cyberbullying specifically, it is completely okay to put controls on your computers for what your children are allowed to see based by age. Your kids will be mad at you, and that's okay. You can blame it on me, but have them watch the video. It's okay. So this can be for little kids, having little icons on the front page of your iPad where you tell your little kids, you can touch this one or this one or this one. Those are things that are okay for you to look at, but that's it. That's all right. For older kids, you can just have a really frank discussion with them. Set up their social media accounts with them. Again, they're not going to like it, and that's okay from a psychologist perspective. Know their passwords. It's perfectly all right to have some kind of a rule in your household whereby if you try to log in to your children's social media and you're unable to do so, that they're limited from their technology, the availability of technology. That's okay to do. If you want to get really clever, and if you do this, I would recommend that you share this with your children so the playing field is fair. There's also a tracking device where you can figure out what types of websites or even what your child has said online. All those types of things can be helpful. In terms of talking to your children about what to do, you will know sort of how your child fits in to the social caste system in your child's school. For children who have relatively high social status, these kids have lots of friends, the teachers like them, they're popular, make friends pretty easily. We encourage those children, if they feel comfortable, to stand up for children who are bullied, to either say to the aggressor, that's not really okay, and then take the victim under their wing, or if not that, then to tell a teacher or tell another trusted adult. As children get older and move into their adolescence or older teenage years, very bold or confident children may take it a step further. It is reasonable to say to your children, you've talked a lot about this Sarah girl. I know you were very good friends when you were younger. You've mentioned that you've seen her change over time. She looks like she's kind of quiet and sad and isn't really hanging out anymore. I wonder what would happen if you asked her what's going on. Encouraging your children to reach out to their friends, to reach out to other children at school is a reasonable thing to do. Remember, our goal here is to create a social fabric that is integrated and where everyone feels like they have an outlet. If your child happens to be the victim of bullying, there are a number of recommendations that we make. One of the most simple ones is to have a safe adult at the child's school who your victim child can go talk to when bullying happens. This doesn't have to look like raising their hand in class and tattling. It's not what I mean. It can be as sort of coded as when your child thinks they've been bullied, they put a pencil on the left-hand corner of their desk, and that's the signal to the teacher that something bad happened. Or that's the signal to the teacher to excuse your child so they can go talk to their music teacher or their PE coach or somebody else who makes them feel safe. It's also okay to talk to your children's school teachers and to have specific questions and specific recommendations. We recommend going into those meetings and modeling the same thing you'd want your children to do in a conflict situation, much as Dr. Hoffman was saying earlier. Go into those situations and say to the teachers, you're the expert in your classroom, and I respect what you have found works in your classroom. I also want to make sure that my daughter's voice is being heard and that I can help come up with a solution to this bullying and work as a team with your child's school to try and help your child get through those victim experiences. If you find your child has been a victim, you can also get your child involved in cooperative, team-based activities. It turns out that having mastery in at least one specialty area, whether it's ballet or singing or football or track, can protect children against the long-term negative mental health impacts of chronic bullying. It is also the case that having just one best friendship can protect children against the negative effects of chronic bullying. So on that note, as a parent, you can foster best friendships. You can say, hey, Alexis, why don't you invite Carly over this weekend? Why don't we have a sleepover? Help them spend more time with those children, or the other children who are friends with them. Help your children develop social skills. If you find that your child's victim status or that your child is a bully and that those things have sort of surpassed what you as a parent feel you have resources to fix, there's help available, just like Dr. Hoffman was saying. It is not the case that a mental health professional can fix everything, but we sure can give some tools and we sure can help where there's a research base for us to know what to do to help, which is most of the time in these sorts of cases. So get help. Call around to or log into your insurance company, see what providers are available, and just choose one. Just try. Meet somebody for a couple times, see if you like them. Those are my primary recommendations. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Faith. That was excellent, and I wrote down some tips, too, for our future with my son. It's next my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jasmine Reese. Dr. Reese is an adolescent medicine specialist and the director of the Adolescent and Young Adult Specialty Program here at Johns Hopkins All Children's. She's also an assistant professor of pediatrics for Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and the Adolescent Medicine Rotation Director of the Pediatric Residency Program. She has specialization in the healthcare of teens and young adults, ages 12 to 21. She has expertise in the evaluation and management of a variety of diagnoses, including depression, anxiety, disordered eating, reproductive health irregularities, as well as chronic medical conditions common in the adolescent age group. We welcome Dr. Reese, and she's going to be speaking on identifying depression in youth. Thank you, Dr. Reese.
Although it is so sad and unfortunate that we're here because of the recent events that had happened, I am extremely happy that we're here to talk about this very important topic of mental health. And it is something that I do work with on a daily basis with adolescents and teenagers. And so I'm really happy to share these different warning signs that hopefully you can take back with you to really identify children and adolescents who need further evaluation and care. And just to sort of highlight why this is so important, this is not really just a St. Pete problem or Tampa Bay problem or Florida problem. It really is a national issue when we're talking about childhood and adolescent depression. If you look at recent data and statistics, we're looking at 1 in 5 children and adolescents who are suffering with a mental health illness, and only about 20% of those kids are actually getting the required treatment. And you might ask, well, why is that so? Why is this happening? It's not because people don't care about it. If you think about the different barriers and access to care, this is really a national issue. So if you think about those families who maybe live in rural areas where they don't have direct access to a pediatrician that's down the road or a psychiatrist that's down the road, they might have to travel quite far to get care. They might have limited financial resources. Their insurance plan might not cover mental health treatment. And so you can think of a list of reasons why that individual might not get direct access to care. And so that comes back to where we see these rising numbers in childhood and adolescent depression. Another point to sort of highlight why this is so important, if you look at data that suggests how teens are sort of feeling. So there are national surveys that go out to high school students across our country that ask them different questions on their high-risk behaviors. One of the questions that this survey addresses is their emotional status and feelings of suicidal ideation and sadness. And so about 30% of high school students said that they felt sad or hopeless on a daily basis for at least a 2-week period. About 17% admitted to feeling suicidal, and about 14% actually had a suicide plan in place. And so, even 1% is too many, and so these numbers are really what we want to try to address and understand why that's the way that they're feeling. And then what do we do about it? So when we think about depression, we also need to understand what is depression, how do we define it, and what does that mean? So depression, if we're really talking about like major depressive disorder, this is a mental health diagnosis, and we're talking about an individual who feels sad and hopeless pretty much on a daily basis for at least a 2-week period, who is basically losing function. Okay, so they're not somebody who is grieving because they lost their best friend in a tragic accident, or they got in a fight with a family member and they're feeling sad today. Their pet may have passed away. Okay, that's somebody who feels sad and who might be grieving, or there was some event that led to a few sad days, and with time they get better, but they're still functioning academically, socially, with their family. They're still engaged in their sports activities. So that's what depression is not. When we're talking about somebody who's truly depressed, we're talking about these recurrent and ongoing persistent symptoms of feeling disengaged. They might be displaying more symptoms of fatigue, tiredness, losing functioning at school. So maybe we're missing a lot more school days. Our grades used to be passing and doing fairly well, to now we're failing classes. One thing that I think we forget about with teens, we're used to seeing in adult world more of the sleepiness and fatigue. You imagine somebody being in bed a lot. With children and adolescents, it tends to be more irritability, lashing out. A lot of parents will come back and tell me their attitude has totally changed. Everything that you suggest to them, now they're lashing back out at me, and they don't want to do anything that I say, and all I asked them was, what do they want for dinner? So, there's also a fine line between what an adolescent sort of typical behavior is during the teen years when their hormones are changing and their social life is changing, to the point of whereas now we're worried about this kid being depressed. And again, it goes back to, are they truly losing functioning? And again, how is this affecting their daily life and for what period of time? So I typically will hear, again, that story of my teen has totally changed. They used to be in 2 or 3 sport activities, and now they don't want to be in any sports. Their friend groups have changed. They used to like going out to the movies on the weekends. Now they want to be in their room, door closed. They're not engaging with the family as much. So really, this drastic change in sort of the behaviors that the parents are not typically used to seeing. So what can parents do to sort of help this teen and child to engage in conversation? So you already heard a talk about cyberbullying. I think social media has sort of changed the game a little bit in terms of our teen behaviors. They're very much focused on social media a lot of times now. This is a great outlet to plug into their friends on a recurrent, consistent basis throughout the day. But plugging into what types of social media they're engaged in. If they let you friend request them, that would be great. So we heard Michelle say that her teen actually showed her the Snapchat of what somebody else was doing, and that's so great because some teens don't want to share with mom anything with their social media. So if it's not you, if you can identify another trusted adult within the family, if it's the aunt or an uncle or a neighbor that you trust, that can sort of plug in with your teen and just talk about how they're feeling. Just open up that dialogue so we have a better understanding of what behaviors they're engaging in, what types of social media they're engaging in. That becomes so very important because I have personally worked with families who the only way that they knew something was going on was because a friend called the parent to say, this is what so-and-so posted on their news feed. And so it really does become an important conversation in just understanding what they're placing out on their social media accounts. Other things that you want to say to teens. A lot of times we think that teens don't want to talk to adults and they don't want to share things. They actually want to share, and I think a lot of times they feel like they're not heard or that adults don't really care what they have to say. As soon as I have a teen in clinic and I have them separated from their parent, it's kind of like diary of the mouth. They're ready to tell me everything that I didn't even ask about. They do want to be heard. And anytime that I've even suggested, the potential of maybe needing a medicine or a psychologist or therapist to talk to, very few times that they really say they don't want that. They do want that outlet space. They do want to be heard, and a lot of times they really do want the help. Even those kids that I've had to put in mental health facilities for further care because of suicidal ideation or attempts, they too want the help. I've not had anyone kicking and screaming. I'm not saying they're all excited about it, but a lot of times they really do want the help. And again, just to highlight the importance of this, if you think about the leading causes of death amongst our adolescents and young adults, we're looking at number 1 being motor vehicle accidents, number 2 being suicide, and number 3 homicide. So we're really looking at the top three causes of death, with 2 and 3 really always kind of competing for the second and third. So suicide and homicide are sort of neck and neck. And so again, this becomes a very important topic to consider. It becomes an important thing to talk about and to educate ourselves about. How do we identify these kids? And then what do we do about it? So I would say the first step is, at bare minimum, get your pediatrician involved. We're used to sending our kids to the pediatrician for the annual well-child checkups, which is great. But you can also make an appointment for just a concern of behavior change, and if your pediatrician knows that they're coming in for that ahead of time, it usually will allow them maybe to block, instead of the 15 minutes that they usually would block, maybe that'll mean they'll block 30 minutes to give you some extra time to really just focus on that particular issue. I think it becomes challenging for your primary care providers when you're there for the annual visit and then they're ready to leave the visit, and you're like, by the way, they've been failing school, and I think she's suicidal. And so then it becomes now a delay to get the next appointment in. And so it's okay to do that if that's, what's happening that moment. But again, just to have a plan of preparedness, that would be a great step in just making the appointment solely to focus on that behavior change that will let your provider then get you the appropriate next step and care that you might need. So maybe that means they're going to identify maybe the local therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist if that's truly what you need. Thank you very much.
Okay, so for this next talk, actually, I'm going to be covering for Dr. Chavis, and we're going to be talking about management of your own anxiety as a parent and returning your child to school. And as a new parent myself, it's really not about anxiety for one event, it's basically anxiety for every single event that goes on every day and every moment that that child isn't within my eyesight, and probably 95% of the time when he is in my eyesight, too. It's a very busy household right now, and we only have one, so for Michelle with 4, I give you all the credit in the world. I don't know how you do that. But I think one of the primary pieces in the ways as parents to manage our anxiety and to prepare ourselves for these events is to do exactly what you're doing right now, inform ourselves. We don't want to go too far down the Dr. Google path and get down a little rabbit hole of information, but also being aware of ways to prepare ourselves, ways to prepare our children, and really that preparedness word is most important. Making sure that from the start, we know maybe not what we're going to say in the moment, but we have some thoughts of what that might look like and ways to keep our body calm in the moment. So we're going to practice some of those things together today. You hear this a lot, and often we use kind of the quote, and I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it, happy wife, happy life. Well, happy parents, happy family, and emotionally adjusted parents who are healthy and recognize coping skills and model those coping skills assist us with also having children who are well-adjusted and children who are able to cope in situations such as this. So I'm going to say it, and I know we all know it, but drink a lot of water, eat healthy, get a good night's rest, and also exercise. That last piece, exercise, I see people smiling and laughing. Yeah, right, when? Good luck. Even if it just means a few minutes of power walking, getting yourself to a place where you have good, healthy lifestyle choices. The next piece is helping each other. And again, this is why I love a forum event like this. We're here as a support for each other, as a community, as a hospital, as my team of amazing psychologists in this hospital team, and as parents, supporting one another, being there with ideas and listening. And that means listening from our families, listening from other parents, but also listening to our kids. One of the hardest things I talk about with parents is just sitting in the silence, maybe asking a question, not getting a response, and then we tend to jump with some gunfire questions into the next ones. Oh, I apologize for that, was probably bad, but moving too quickly through questions that go boom, 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 rather than sitting in the silence and listening. In addition, making sure that you're giving yourself a break. Taking time to do things like rest, again, taking good care of yourself, and taking a moment to stop and think about what just happened and what your reaction is to that. How do you feel as a result of this event? And then also modeling that for your child. When you take that moment to stop and think, and also be able to calm yourself down to really realize how this has impacted you, we give ourselves the opportunity to model that for our children. So we're going to practice some of those skills together that we call coping skills, and everyone has different types of coping skills. For some people, we are journaling, we're listening to music to calm ourselves down, we're talking with family and friends or a trusted therapist. For others, we're using things like deep breathing and meditation. And so what I'm going to ask you to do right now is practice some of that deep breathing. So we're going to start by putting our hands on our stomachs. We're going to close our eyes. And we're going to practice taking in a deep breath, expanding our stomach, and then pushing that breath back out. And so I want your hands to be moving forward and to be moving back. And so deep breath in, you want to push that air all the way down into our stomach, and then exhale that breath back out. And we're going to go nice and slow. I'd even like to see you count to 5 on your inhale in, and then 5 on your exhale out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want those hands to move up and down each time, and we're going to do one more of those too. So breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In addition to that deep breathing, which really is something we want to practice every day. So even if you just find 3 or 4 minutes each day to sit and breathe, if you have an Apple Watch, your watch is reminding you to do it all the time, and for many of us, you're just ignoring it every time that happens. But try to take that time with your Apple Watch, with your thought process, to just take those deep breaths and calm your body down. The practice up front, and the more that you can do that in advance, the better you'll be able to utilize those skills in the moment when they're necessary. And so that's what we talk about, breathing in advance, practicing these in advance, so that when we have a situation in which the anxiety is high, the stress is through the roof, we can take a moment, utilize these skills to calm our body down, and then be able to clear our heads. In addition, some of us will use meditation apps. There are some great apps available that allow you to, again, take those few minutes to practice on a mantra or a meditation to be able to calm yourself down, calm your body down, and clear our thoughts. When we're feeling stressed and anxious, especially when doing public speaking or in a situation in which there has been a significant trauma, such as what we've experienced recently, that gives your body the opportunity to calm down, calm the adrenaline down, and then be able to think more clearly. When we are stressed in these events, we find that our decision-making can be impaired. We aren't able to think as calmly and rationally as we're typically able to. And so we want to be able to do that. This is not the time following a traumatic incident to be making rash decisions, to be making big life changes or big decisions. We want to calm ourselves down first, and I want to keep saying that, bringing ourselves back down to baseline to allow our thoughts to be calm and to be back into that rational state. Another opportunity for coping that we can use is what's called grounding. We're going to talk about that today in terms of when we have a traumatic event, we may feel a sense of being completely out of control, complete panic. Where do I go? What do I do? And the thoughts are just racing. And so when we talk about grounding, grounding is a way for us to bring our bodies back to the moment, to bring ourselves back to the moment, so that we can recognize and be present in where we are right now. And the real goal behind grounding is focusing on our 5 senses, to take away the feelings of panic, the feelings of being out of control, and recognizing where we are in space right now. And so if I were to be doing grounding right now, I would want to be focused on the 5 senses in terms of sight. What do I see in front of me? Repeating to myself what I see. I see chairs, I see a microphone, I see an audience. Being able to listen and hear. What do I hear? What sounds are there? Getting that information in. Recognizing where you are. Again, bringing your back down into the present space. What do I touch or what do I feel? So I can feel the podium in front of me. I can feel papers. Bringing yourself back to that present moment. Now the 2 next ones are the more difficult ones, smell and taste. So smell, right now, I smell cleaning fluid, and so it may just be whatever smell is right in front of you. It may be food, it may be some smell just in the environment. Even for some of us who have maybe more anxiety and recognize that this is something that may occur more frequently, using a specific perfume or a specific scent to remind yourself to stay calm and in the moment. So again, if you are having an oil or a perfume you can have on your skin, that is a good reminder to, again, bring yourself back down. And then the taste one. The taste one is always more difficult. If we know that we're prone to more panic, more anxiety, more stress, having something with you that is a taste or a reminder to stay calm in the moment. It may be a piece of gum, it may be a mint, but you want to be utilizing all 5 senses at once and talking yourself through that as well. Bringing yourself back to the present moment, utilizing the deep breathing at the same time, because the next piece of the puzzle is really that most important one, and that's cognitive restructuring. The first half of that is ways that we calm our body down, that we get the adrenaline back down, that we bring ourselves back to the moment. But then we need to address the thoughts that are running through our mind, and as we've heard so far today, inevitably running through our children's minds as well. And so as we return to school, as we return following any traumatic event, we want to be able to reassure ourselves and our children that they're safe. And one of the other pieces is that we may not know with 100% certainty that they are safe. And so saying that I don't know is okay, but again, reassuring our children, our families, that every adult has taken every possible precaution to ensure that their safety is the primary piece of the puzzle. We also want to be honest with ourselves about that. And so if there are negative thoughts that are creeping in because of a previous trauma that we've experienced, a previous trauma in the family, a way in which the family has been impacted, recognizing that the thoughts may go on, what we can address ourselves individually. And then that is the next step in seeking help, which we'll continue to talk about. But really making sure that we're also turning the negative thoughts into ones that are more rational, realistic, and reasonable in the moment. So catastrophizing the future without knowing whether or not that future will actually happen, in the moment we need to stop, think, and problem solve moving forward and how to do that in the best way. Those conversations we also want to have with our children. So preparing for safety, what is our family plan if there is a traumatic event? Do we have one in place? Do our children know where to go? Do our children know where I will be or where their father will be if something traumatic or violent, catastrophic is to happen? And if they don't, let's put that plan in place right now. Let's get the family together, sit down and say, where are we going to meet? What should you expect? If your cell phone doesn't work, cell phones are such a huge part of our communication now. If your cell phone doesn't work, where do you go next? Who is allowed to pick you up? Who's allowed to come get you? Making sure that that plan is there so they have clear expectations as to what to happen after. At school, who is their safety person? Where is their safety place? Schools are having these drills now in order to prepare, but also, and the more information we can have up front, both from the school and home perspectives, the better. In addition to that, once something like this has happened, the skills that we're talking about now are the ones that we want to model for our children for strong adjustment. How do we make sure that our kids we've modeled these behaviors for our children, that we've given them the tools necessary? And being honest about that. When we're sitting down to talk about having these conversations, being present. Our cell phones are such a huge part of our lives, but when we go in to talk with our family about what has happened, having 3 or 4 points in mind, and then expressing those without checking our cell phones, even asking everyone to check their cell phone at the door, might be the best opportunity to be able to have that conversation in a very present context. Also, again, it's okay to say, I don't know, but at the end of the day, we want to reassure safety. The primary goal for all of us as parents, and why you're here again tonight, is to ensure our children are safe and that they have everything they need. And one piece of the puzzle, especially now moving forward, is preparation. So utilizing these skills, recognizing when we need help, and also being able to provide these modeled behaviors for our children will help set us up for success from the start. Thank you. So next I will introduce Dr. Valerie Valle. She is a licensed psychologist who specializes in sports and performance psychology. She is responsible for providing comprehensive psychological services to our student athletes. She also provides psychological assessments, individual and group therapy. She conducts research, trains psychology interns, and consults with various local youth sport organizations. Dr. Valle was previously a member of the NFL NCAA mental health think tank as a subject matter expert. She's a certified consultant with the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, and she's listed on the United States Olympic Committee Sports Psychology Registry. Welcome, Dr. Valle.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Val Valle. I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in sport and performance psychology. And what is that exactly? Well, it's someone who is very interested in working with athletes and helping them to develop the ideal mindset and to practice psychological skills required for success, not just in sport, but in life. Currently, my job is at IMG. IMG is a boarding school for sports. And so at IMG Academy, I work with 1,100 student athletes coming from all over the world. They represent 70 countries nationwide, and often English is their second language coming to the school. They're boarding from 6th grade to post-grad, so that's from 12 to about 19 or 20, but we also offer pre-K, so it's quite a diverse campus of little student athletes. And the goal of these student athletes who come to IMG is really to pursue their sport and reach the highest level they can possible, and whether that's at the collegiate or professional level. Now, I often get kind of questions like, so Val, like, what do you do as a sports psychologist? Like, do athletes really need help, or athletes don't have mental health issues? Well, they do. And in fact, in a recent NCAA Sports Science Institute study, we see that student athletes are at as much risk, if not more risk, than their non-athlete peers. And this is because of the unique culture of athletics, one that really promotes toughness. It's about these increased time demands faced by our student athletes for practice, for training, for travel, for competition. This increased public scrutiny that they face, and for this athletic identity, which often is the only identity that they have. So of course, when they're injured or things aren't going well in sport, they suffer quite a bit. Dr. Reese mentioned that 1 in 5 children around the ages of 13 to 18 will have a mental illness. And this is certainly true among the youth that we work with in schools. In a school setting, well, before I go there, to really kind of understand mental illness and how psychologists view mental illness, really the most basic way to describe that is to identify level of distress and level of dysfunction. And so you can imagine a continuum, right? And so on one end of this continuum is health, well-being, peak performance, self-actualization, right? So this is where we all want to be, right? On the other end of the continuum is illness. This is where we have high emotional distress, high emotional dysfunction. Now, our children on campuses and student athletes are walking along that entire continuum. We can call this the continuum of humanity, really. But I think it's useful to teach our gatekeepers on campuses and our students how to recognize these signs of distress and dysfunction so that they can engage and interact proactively and really kind of help before these issues become problematic. So the primary goal of most educational institutions nowadays, and particularly post-Virginia Tech massacre, is to promote safety and a safe and healthy campus. There's 3 key ways that psychologists can help campuses to do this. And one is to teach how to identify signs and symptoms of distress. So we teach students, we teach those campus gatekeepers, and those are anyone from faculty, administrators, coaches, all the way down to the kitchen staff and those serving at the cafeteria, on what some of these signs and symptoms look like. Secondly, psychologists can help these campuses train students and gatekeepers on how to help, how to respond to these kids in distress. And thirdly, psychologists can help to establish or manage what are called threat assessment teams, so we can proactively really kind of respond to these issues. So let's go through each one of those briefly. So identifying signs and symptoms of students in distress. In your packet, you'll see a little handout, looks like this. It specifically talks about warning signs of violence. And I'm not going to specifically talk about that because what is much more prevalent are signs and symptoms of depression, as Dr. Reese touched on, and suicidality. And so some of these emotional distress signs that we might see as a gatekeeper or student are tearfulness, irritability, loss of interest. Some physiological signs are decreased energy, somatic complaints like headaches, stomach aches, disturbance of appetite and sleep, cognitive changes where there's this negative internal dialogue or self-talk. There might be suicidal thoughts. Concentration is impaired. And behaviorally, we might see withdrawal, we might see some isolation, avoidance behaviors, absenteeism, tardiness. And again, the idea of training each other and these gatekeepers on identifying these signs and symptoms is not just a one and done, but to look across a pattern of their functioning, both in the classroom, maybe on the field in their sport, at home, in their social arena. And so if we're seeing Jimmy, who is inattentive in class, absent, not participating in work, maybe this is Jimmy's regular behavior, so that wouldn't be a sign and symptom that a teacher necessarily would report. But if this is a student that's very conscientious, always on time, really producing quite consistent kind of A material, and all of a sudden is not showing up, is not consistent, that might be a sign of distress that we want to attend to. So how do we help when we identify some of these signs and symptoms of distress? One is we can teach students and gatekeepers on some of these basic counseling skills. You don't have to be a psychologist or a licensed mental health professional to know how to do active listening, but this is something that we can teach. And oftentimes, this is really the primary antidote, that if a teacher, coach, or someone or a student simply hears and listens, reflects back, that often can really just put someone at ease. Something else that we can do with schools is to teach pro-social behavior. This is creating cultures of care and concern. It's encouraging and empowering how to report concerning behavior, and also help-seeking behavior. And of course, it's teaching people who to tell, who to refer to. It's not teacher's responsibility or a coach's responsibility to be a psychologist, but it is your responsibility to identify signs and symptoms and get that student to the right channel. Lastly, psychologists can help school systems in organizing what are called threat assessment teams. These are called many different things. At IMG, we call it the Student Wellbeing Committee. Generally, these teams are multidisciplinary, which means there's many different people, many gatekeepers from different parts of campus who are on them. At IMG, I'm part of that. We have someone from health services, we have someone from the sport arena, we have administration, we have faculty, we have a disciplinary committee person. An idea is to collect information from all these different sources to identify students who could be potentially at risk and to proactively and preventatively give services to these students to reduce that distress. So it could be maybe a referral to mental health care, it could be maybe mentoring, or maybe it's something in the classroom regarding accommodations. But in summary, instead of focusing on trying to prevent others from being violent, we should be focusing on promoting pro-social behavior and a culture of looking out for each other. The best way to manage potential risk is by advancing student health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valle. I would like to invite all of our speakers up to the panel at the front, as well as Dr. Mark Cavett, who will be joining us. He's the director of the Mind-Body branch and a triple board certified pediatric psychiatrist here at the hospital. And also Sergeant Bill Burris, who is our representative from the St. Pete Police Department, to join us up here as well. Thank you very much to everyone. Michelle will be coming around to collect any index cards for, I'm going to get you a microphone. Of any of the questions that you may have in advance. Also, inside your folders, you'll find a sheet of paper that allows you to sign up for any additional services or conversations you may wish to have. So at the end of today's event, if you would like to meet with a group on an additional day, on a Saturday, both for parents and for our youth, please leave that sheet that's in your packet face down And with enough interest to gauge that, we'll be able to contact you and get additional information out about following up. Thank you.
So one of the concerns that I mentioned when I was first doing the welcome that I found myself is how much is too much? I feel like they were getting inundated it was all over the news, it was all you saw all day long on TV. They're getting it at school, of course, social media. So where's the line between being there and talking to your children, but also maybe giving them a break from it?
I have a.
Maybe it's already on.
Hold it down, maybe. Can you hear me?
I think it's already on.
Can you hear me? Oh, I guess it stays red. Okay. Sorry, we didn't realize that. So I think that's a good question. One thing I'm thinking is by letting kids be in the lead, as I discussed earlier, and letting them ask the questions, some kids you may find are just done. It might be too much information. When they're done asking questions, it's okay to tell them, I'm here for you. If you have any other questions, please come talk to me, and kind of let them approach you. But at the same time, you want to be looking for those signs, like lots of our speakers had mentioned today. If you feel like there's a change in their behavior, or you're more concerned about something, then definitely go back to them. But I think it can be kind of overwhelming for kids, for parents to keep asking how they're feeling over and over and over. So again, just letting kids know that you're there and you're available and you want to talk with them, and letting them come to you after your initial conversation is my advice.
I would add to Michelle, to that question, that we have to remember that we're talking about an entire continuum of children and adolescents, those who are currently psychologically unhealthy and those who have their psychological illnesses. And so that we as parents need to protect, especially those of our children and adolescents who already have diagnoses and may be treated. We have to protect them from repeated images. So the social media is covered with personal phone videos taken of shooting events, et cetera, that just loop over and over and over. And as fascinating as that can be, especially to curious minds, it further traumatizes our children. So I think one of the other active roles parents take is to minimize access to media and social media events of repetitive, redundant coverage that simply, frankly, increases the trauma.
Any other questions from the audience? I've got a question from the audience. This is about how can a parent help when they know the student is being bullied, but the administration doesn't act?
So every state has laws around peer victimization and what schools have to do. In the state of Florida, every school district has to have a written policy about what they'll do if there's bullying, what the consequences will be, how they will offer help to both the victim and the bully. So knowing that and arming yourself with that information as a parent can benefit you. One thing that I recommend is making a request in writing of your child's school counselor or principal or both that they investigate the bullying incident. And this is not an aggressive thing to do. It's not going to be a challenging worded letter. It's a letter that is just respectfully saying, I learned from my child that this happened. I'd really like it if you'd look into it and figure out what's going on and how we can prevent future problems. After that, though, your work's not done, I would recommend that as a parent, you schedule a meeting with everybody at your child's school who might be important in this incident. That might be the teacher, it might be the lunchroom monitors, it might be the safety patrols outside of school in the beginning of school. We do know that bullying happens most frequently during unstructured school times like recess and lunch, also during times of school transition, so like right as kids are transitioning into middle school, for example. So invite whoever needs to be there at that meeting and go to a meeting at your child's school to ask questions, to make specific requests of the school perhaps. You want to leave that meeting with a written plan saying exactly what everybody's going to do. So I, as the parent, I'm going to seek out counseling for my child. The teacher is going to monitor the lunchroom interactions and kind of stand behind my child behind the lunchroom table to make sure that bullying's not happening during that time. Maybe the counselor is is going to give some sort of a lesson to the whole class about what bullying is, what it isn't, and how we prevent it as a class, different steps that everybody can take. Leave the meeting with that written plan, and then follow a schedule-up meeting about a month later, just to make sure that things are being done. Among all the things you can do as a parent, getting the school involved is one of the most important, because oftentimes that's where bullying is happening. And so the interventions really do need to be at the school to keep victimization from becoming worse.
Okay, I have to follow up on this because this incident happened recently at IMG, where I'm not going to mention names, but a student was being bullied by his teammates, and his parents did exactly what you said. They swooped in with documents, with all this legal jargon. A meeting was made with the head of school, disciplinary committee, all these people on board, and it didn't help the child at all. If anything, I think it probably, I don't know, created more isolation now and increased scrutiny from teammates, although no one was saying anything. So how do we, is there another way that we can really more empower the child to go back to the setting and have these hard communications rather than maybe the parents' first thing to swoop in? And this was just I don't know how long the history of, in this question had been going on with bullying, but maybe a first or second kind of time.
Great questions. And kids are scared of this. A lot of times teenagers won't tell their parents they're being bullied specifically because they're worried about that. The problem is we spend a lot of time telling kids who are victimized what to do different, but most of the research is very clear that once you are a chronic victim, no matter what you do, there's very little you can do to break out of being a chronic victim in that classroom, in that school. And so some states actually have laws that permit parents to have their victimized child transferred into another classroom or another school. I've met a lot of parents who feel very upset about that and feel like, if my child's victimized, why should my child have to move? But it's because the research is very clear that that's a far better outcome for that victimized child than just moving the bully or just trying to tell the child to do something differently. Now, all of that said, there are some pretty some pretty common deficits that kids who are victimized develop over time, in part because the things that are problems maybe made them more likely to be bullied, but also because when you're bullied, you tend to sort of isolate. If you know somebody's going to be mean to you, you're not going to approach them nearly as frequently as you would otherwise. And so we see that a lot of times victims will have deficits in social skills. They'll also have deficits sometimes in coping skills. So in general, when something bad happens, you'll see that these might be the sorts of kids who either pull everything inward and blame themselves or become very worried, or the opposite, or both. So the opposite being where they'd fight back, or they'd yell, or they'd act out in class. There could be a combination of things as well. And so there are some coping skills types of programs that can be helpful as well, that usually as a parent you would access through a mental health professional. Now again, that's not a surefire way, because once a child is victimized, there is that larger culture that's very difficult to break. That's why a lot of times we'll recommend transitioning into another class, but those are steps that you can take. And then very quickly, as a parent, I'll say the other thing you can do, you can't necessarily affect 100% change in your child's school. It's sort of a very difficult part of being a parent, is sitting with the discomfort of knowing that you can't fix it all the time. But what you can do is protect your child from some of the risks of negative psychological problems long term. So even if my child's going to be victimized, what can I do to prevent them from becoming adults who are depressed and anxious and don't go to college because they're scared? And so some things that you can do, like we talked about, fostering best friendships is a big one. Helping your child develop mastery in something that they feel comfortable in, that can be an outlet for them. Helping your child talk about things that are very difficult without swooping in and trying to fix it all the time. As parents, we can sometimes feel very uncomfortable allowing our children to be sad or worried or cry. Those are very healthy things for children to do, especially in the context of being bullied. And so allowing your child to talk about those things without you as a parent jumping in and saying, oh, I'm going to fix this, or you better wait and see what's going to happen tomorrow. Sometimes just letting your kids talk to you so you're a safe resource can be the answer as well.
Great, thank you. Is there any follow-up or any other questions? Right here.
Yeah, what do you think can be done to prevent or to reduce the times this happens, or even prevent it from happening in the future?
Yeah. Can I start? So I think, yeah, that's the question, the elephant in the room question, isn't it? What do we do? You know, I think, honestly, everybody starts from wherever they are with their own reflexive reactions. And so you know, again, some people immediately launch into the gun issue and gun ownership, et cetera. But by the same token, you know, we have to look at the other dynamic, which is the vast majority of these incidents are committed by men. So hopefully we don't talk about banning men. But it's a very, right? No, I don't know. You know, it's a very complicated situation. We really need to take a look at this from a public policy standpoint. So we have our reflexive reactions, and those can be extremely mobilizing. So, you know, we applaud the voice of not only agony, but anger and desire for change and justice that occurs after these events. But we also need to take a look from a public policy standpoint and look at all the contributors to these kind of violent incidents. We recognize that, you know, the United States is not unique. I think as a psychiatrist, I would also like to say I think we have to be careful not to blame mental illness for every event like this, because the reality is statistically under 10% of violent crimes are committed by people who have diagnosed mental illness. So most violent crimes are not committed by the mentally ill. So we need to be careful about stigmatizing the mentally ill and violent crimes. If you look at other societies and cultures that have the same rates of mental illness as we have in the U.S., they have remarkably lower rates of gun violence and death by homicide or suicide. So what do? We start by reacting honestly, as people have done in both, I think, personally and collectively, and we move to the broader issues of trying to take a pause, take a breath, take a look at these things, and then activate research, gather the data. So much of the difficulty in addressing exactly your question has been that research isn't well funded in these areas. So you get small studies here and there, but we don't have funding for these kinds of things. And if we're looking at a public health issue like violence and death by violence, this needs to be research funded on a national scale that translates down into every community. You know, in the audience we have Dr. Berman, who's an infectious disease expert, and he knows probably better than most of us here about how you translate public health policy all the way down from, you know, identifying the source of disease, identifying the vectors for transmission, identifying how to protect individuals and then communities from illness and how to react. So I think we have to look at all these various levels of the question. But I think what we have to do, and I think exactly what your question points to, we have to give voice in the ways that we are uniquely motivated and talented to do so, whether it's in social media, whether it's in organizing, whether it's in contacting our elected officials, whether it's in our academic pursuits and our professional pursuits. It has to go beyond just ourselves. That's my response.
Okay, hang on a second. How old are you? 16. Okay. So from a 16-year-old, did that really answer your question? What else do you want to know? What about like peers? Do you wonder like what you and your friends or what each other can maybe do to minimize something like this in the future? Has that been anything that you guys have talked about?
I mean, a lot of times it's kind of avoided in conversation just because no one really wants to say the wrong thing. But I mean, that's definitely something that gets thought about is like, personally, what can you do? Like, yeah.
Okay, I can talk on that a little bit, and it's a very simple answer. Look out for each other. Right? So create that culture of support, of looking out for each other, speaking up, reporting things. Right? Question in the back?
So just to expand on that, I have a 7th grade girl, and we started noticing in 4th and 5th grade the queen bee wannabe type sort of syndrome. And what we struggle with as parents is getting the administration on board that A, this is happening, that we're seeing it, and B, how do we create a more inclusionary culture with our children when their environment is an establishment that they spend 6 to 8 hours of their day and we're not there? So how do we get movement from our administration, from our teachers, from the other kids' parents to kind of go back to create a culture of inclusionariness, of cooperation, of you don't have to be my best friend, but I'm not going to turn my back on you. I'm going to include you instead of pick on you. And you being less than me isn't what I need for me to be more. How do we attack this? She's nodding. How do we attack this prior to it becoming to the point where we have children that are being victimized? And I understand we're not going to address all of it, but I think that for my child, the trouble that she had navigating started well before, and she's not a victim, but well before it would get to victim status or chronic victim status. And then without that environment, how do we have children actually have their friends back without being worried about being the next victim? Or how do we have multiple children have somebody's back?
The problem you're describing, it happens for boys and girls, but what you're describing is very much that relational victimization, or what I call that mean girls effect. It is more common in girls than it is in boys, and it tends to get worse by the end of elementary school, heading into middle school. The good news is that it does tend to decline in frequency by the end of high school, but those children who continue to be on the low end of the totem pole through high school are at risk. So you're very well justified to be concerned about this culture. I'll say bullying has happened forever. We are more worried about those kids who are chronically on the low end of the totem pole. Those are the 10 to 20% we're really worried about. And there are a couple of things, several different aspects that I think we can look at when we're talking about this issue. One of them is sort of a culture and teaching our children this you before everyone else sort of thinking. And I don't mean, this is not a generational issue, it's more just helping our children build that compassion, that empathy for other people. Emotion coaching your children. You know, when your children are seeing their siblings crying, for example, helping your children identify what's wrong with their sibling. How do you think they're feeling right now? Why are they feeling that way? Just helping your children build these sorts of skills is something you as a parent can do to help your child contribute positively and pro-socially to their social group. In terms of being a parent of a child who is in that position of being lower on the totem pole chronically, never quite being queen bee, there are a couple things that I think are challenging. One is that when we look at relational bullying, it usually happens by friends. And so children, especially girls, oftentimes are scared to speak out, they're scared to change anything, they're scared to do anything, because they're concerned they're going to lose their social circle if they do, and sometimes they're right. As a parent, things you can do, if your child trusts one of the other children in the social group, it would be reasonable for you as a parent to perhaps reach out to that other child's parent, explain what's going on, and get those friends to help. Get those friends, parents, to talk to their children, not about your child by name, if that's not the right thing to do in that social circle. You'll know that as mom because you know your kid better than anybody does. But perhaps having those friends' parents talk to those children about what it means to leave somebody out. What are things you can do whenever you see somebody being left out, and kind of getting those other children to help. From a teacher perspective, I'll say our teachers work hard, long days, and they do the best they can on a number of arenas. But as funding gets cut more and more, teachers find themselves in the position of being not just a teacher, but also a counselor, and also sometimes doing some parenting work, being a disciplinarian. They have lots of different things they're balancing. Almost all the teachers I've ever worked with, they put their soul into being a teacher. And those who feel like victimization isn't happening in their classroom, it's often not because they're not looking for it, it's because they just really don't want to believe it's true. Unfortunately, we do know that children whose teachers deny risk in their own classroom have children in their classes who are at higher risk, so that's sort of an issue. I think that's sort of a larger
educational issue for school districts more widely, but I don't think it's a teacher lack of effort issue. I think it really is more teachers not knowing perhaps exactly what to do, not having the resources to do it, schools having limited mental health types of services to help with these sorts of things. So I'm always very careful about blaming teachers and saying that they're responsible for the bullying, because that's not always the case. It's very rarely the case, in fact.
And from an administrative standpoint, creating school campuses that are safe and promote the well-being of students, we have to have that buy-in from administrators, because that's where those educational, that's where the policies are going to come from for creating tolerance, for creating well-being, for, doing the pro-social behavior, all that.
And from the parent perspective too, modeling that for our children. And so when we do perhaps do a pro-social behavior, or we're helping someone out, articulating that, and not just in terms of how that makes us feel, but also making sure that our child knows that that's because that's what makes maybe a better place. You don't know what kind of day that person had, or how they might interpret what you've said or what just happened. But being there, talking through that thing, if someone reacts negatively to you, helping children understand that we don't know what the rest of that person's life might look like, and they're coming from a place where that life may look differently than what ours looks like. And I think this is the most difficult part, especially in the face of social media and the way that we present ourselves to the world on social media, to such a larger circle than we've ever been able to before, rather than taking that moment to talk through that, what you've done and why you've done it. Even if it is something as small as, a pass it along, we do one positive thing for someone every day, whether it's picking up a piece of trash in the street or taking care of the person behind us in line at Dunkin' Donuts coffee. We're continually modeling that we're trying to put that positivity out there and helping someone else feel better about themselves. And we don't know how that might impact their life at a greater level.
Thank you. There's a question here.
I have a question that's also kind of what do we do, but a little different direction. One of the solutions that's been posed out there has to do with making the schools more secure, either with teachers having guns as the extreme, but also just more security. And I know with my children, they go to school and they have to, the doors are locked and there's guards at the school. And so the question is, sort of from a psychologist, psychiatrist perspective, but also Sergeant Burroughs, from your perspective, one, what are the effects on the school, on the children of having the security of, what do we know from what these children go through, having to walk through a metal detector every day, having, 2 or 3, officers at their school all the time. What is that doing to our children all the time? I mean, maybe it's a benefit. Is it letting them do they feel safer? Or do they feel more anxiety from all that? And then 2, what is your experience as the actual benefit of having this increased security and having a officer presence at the school, or even a weapon presence at the school? Like, is there any suggestion, or just based on your experience, that those things have a positive or negative effect?
Great.
I think it's a balancing act when you talk about additional security in schools. Not every school has an SRO on site. Some do, some don't. You're going to have some students.
What an SRO is?
I'm sorry, school resource officer. You're going to have some students that welcome the sight of police. It makes them feel better. It makes them feel safe. You're going to have some that maybe don't care to see a police officer there in uniform for security. You could increase security if you wanted to. You could double the amount of officers. Obviously, there's funding, manpower or staffing, and that would affect it. To answer your question about arming teachers, I'll preface it by saying by no means do I want to squash what maybe another jurisdiction says or what they would like to do. I'll give you my own personal perspective. I'm looking at it a little more deeply than just the knee-jerk reaction of having a teacher with a gun, for protection. I look at it a little further personally and say it's ripe with problems. So you could do all the training that you want and train that teacher to use the a gun, but if they have it on campus, I worry about the security of that weapon. I worry about if something does happen, will that teacher actually be able to react? And will it be more of a danger to themselves or the students or law enforcement that's responding? So I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to say we need to arm teachers. That's my personal opinion. And one more thing about that is if you have a gun, we teach our kids, don't touch guns, don't go near guns. If your parents own guns, don't even go near them. Don't talk about them, be safe. But yet we're going to have a teacher with a gun in a classroom. And what if the student who might not have good intentions gets a hold of that gun somehow? I don't think it's a good idea.
So can I follow up there too? Because I get to sample these adolescents one by one all week long, and so I've asked and the conversation's obviously been coming up in clinic a lot in the last couple of weeks. So the overwhelming survey response in my clinic is teachers shouldn't have guns. That it's hard for them to sometimes manage their classroom environment, and the students don't really want a teacher under stress, under duress, aiming guns. But I resonate to your point. Your point about there may be cultures, there may be places in the country where the culture and training, maybe certainly there are districts where teachers are carrying guns, and it's all about the deterrent value is what we keep hearing. But statistically, if you look at the studies, and there was a small study in Philadelphia that looked at if you were a gun owner, you were 4 times more likely of being the victim of a violent crime, and if the gun owner defending their home pulled the gun, they were 5 times more likely to be killed in the course of defending their home. So we have to, and it goes back to my previous comment, we need to know there are small studies on these things, and we can give our own personal reactions. But we need to know what the data really looks like, and we have to develop that data. Now, on the other hand, the deterrence value, there are a couple of studies that say about 3% of what could have been mass shootings were prevented by some armed civilian, some non-law enforcement officer that helped prevent either some carnage or more carnage. But again, we don't have a lot of data on that. But yeah, my informal survey of a sample of 17 or so says, don't put guns in the teacher's hands.
To your point about the data and about not having the research, I can't remember exactly when it was. I think it was back in the 1980s. Our federal government made the choice to cut all funding for research on gun violence. And that's, to me, is one of the things as a parent I can do is let my representatives know that I want research being done on gun violence, because we're never going to figure this out. Right now, there is no right or wrong answers of whether we should have guns, whether we shouldn't have guns. Until we gather the data, it's not going to work. So in terms of bullying, I come at this from somewhat of a unique situation. I take care of a lot of kids with disabilities, and I've run amputee clinics where the child has a clear disability, and I unfortunately didn't have such wonderful psychologists as you guys, so I ended up having to counsel them myself. But lots of bullying going on because it's such an obvious thing. I also am a parent of 2 kids with autism, and I've seen bullying going on there. Coming from a different state, I won't say which one it is because most people from Florida don't like this state, but I came from a state where inclusion was really important. And my first 6 years of my kids are now 17, the first 6 years of their high school or school, they were fully included, even though one of them is very involved. And I can tell you what I've seen, the difference here where they're not included. They're even in a regular school, they were segregated from the rest of the school. they had a much harder time. The kids, the regular kids in the school didn't understand. All they saw them was as they're abnormal. Where that first 6 years, by the end of that 6 years, every child in that school knew who they were. They protected them. They rewarded them whenever they did something good. They learned about what it was to have a disability. And I don't think it's a far stretch to say that being different, and that's oftentimes the reason kids are being bullied, is any different. If we do come together and get the schools to understand that they shouldn't let this happen, that they should be supportive. I forget the term that you guys used in the positive supports. It makes a huge difference. And I'm not seeing that here in Florida, unfortunately. I feel like Florida is about 50 years behind in a lot of the things that they do. So.
Spoken like a Californian.
So there is good evidence that children being friends with other children who have disabilities, whether they're mental health difficulties or physical disabilities, that those children tend to have higher empathy long term. There's not good data to suggest that putting children into exclusionary classrooms where they're self-contained amongst themselves, that helps, although I think that's why those programs were developed initially. There was thought, I think, that putting children who have disabilities in a classroom by themselves will sort of level the playing field. But there's also not data to go the other way, to say that that's not a good thing. Because not a lot of people are doing that sort of research. And I will say, one of the things that's always very important to me, I once had a very great mentor say to me, don't make decisions based on your bowels, meaning let's not make gut decisions, let's use data to make decisions. And so I can't speak specifically as to, that it should be one way or the other. What I will say is the larger thing is making sure that teachers, whether they're special education teachers or mainstream classroom teachers, understand the risk of bullying, and that bullying is almost certainly happening in their classrooms because it's just such a typical peer phenomenon in elementary through high school.
And we have time for about one or two more questions after this as well.
Sergeant Burris, this question's kind of directed to you. As we've talked about, mental health is a component of this, and bullying is a component, but there's a lot more that is at stake and that is kind of bringing us to these situations, unfortunate as they may be. We, being a female and going through personal safety courses myself, have been taught to be aware of my surroundings, aware of the people around me, the looks, the actions, the behaviors, as in what that makes me feel like as far as my security. And where is the level that we can kind of bring that in for our children so that they know when something just doesn't feel right to act on it? Because we're saying, tell them to report something. What do they know to report? They don't know, you can look in someone's eyes and you're like, that person, there's something that I need to check on. As a police officer with your training, you know to do that. How can we bring that into the education for our school, our kids, so that they know when it is worth checking out or avoiding or just removing themselves from?
I can try to answer that. I think that when you're talking about young people, first of all, we're tied to our phones. So oftentimes these kids are distracted and they're really not paying attention to their surroundings. It's just the way society is now. And not to get off on a tangent, but if you go to any public place, whether it be a restaurant or a mall, the majority of people are on their phones, and even people who are dining together are not talking because they're both on their phones. So I'm going to say they need to put the phones down a little bit so you can be more aware of the situation. As far as having kids, I can tell you I have a child who's 24, but when he was younger, of course we taught, when you're going to your car, et cetera, after class, be aware of your surroundings. Well, what does that mean? I think that you could make it really easy. And if your child thinks that something is not right, don't dismiss it. Listen to what they have to say. As far as what you're referring to, a reaction by them, the best reaction that they can do initially is if someone is actually, let's say, following them or they're suspicious of a person, the bad guy, so to speak, they're trying to be anonymous. I think once they're noticed, just a look by your child in their direction might alter that person, what they're doing, if it is suspicious or not. So the first reaction would be, I think, to identify that person, maybe just look at them. It's going to depend on your child and what the situation is if they take it further.
Well, I think even in a school situation, if it is one of their classmates, that something is kind of just making them feel, I just don't feel comfortable around this person, but I can't say exactly what it is, and trying to make that a welcoming environment so that they're just, I don't know, I think it's education on their part, and a kind of age level, it might be more a mental health question combined with that, but just knowing what is not right, because stranger danger is an old school thought. I mean, stranger danger is just something we wish could go away, because that's not really usually the truth. It's someone we know that's doing the harm. Like, you know, most of the students were aware of the student in Parkland, and they knew that he was a problem and he was a danger. So what would have helped to, I don't know, that's kind of 2020. Huh?
But to answer your question on that, I think that if your child is leery of someone at school, whether it be just a gut feeling or something that they overheard, the most important thing is communication, and that is tell somebody, whether it be a teacher or an administrator. They can, of course, remain anonymous and pass on the information. It may help.
Thank you.
And thank you for that question, because really the key question is, why do people not report these signs and symptoms of distressing behavior? As she alluded to, there was plenty of signs of this guy from Parkland who was leaking information. And if we remember the famous social psychology experiment back in the 60s of Kitty Genovese, right? And so in that classic study, this woman was sexually assaulted in front of her New York City apartment building with at least 50 neighbors who were watching and hearing this assault happen, and yet nobody called for help. And in fact, in the case, she left her home to run away and then came back, and a second time the assailant still followed her, and no one called to help with her screams and everything. And so something that we learned from this terrible experience was about this kind of, distribution of information, where people oftentimes don't report because they think someone else is going to do something, right? So everyone's peering through the window and assuming, well, so-and-so is going to call, so-and-so is going to call. So maybe that's going on. What are some other reasons that maybe people don't report things?
I have a quick question on follow-up, sorry. When a student is expelled for behavioral issues, fights, and does the school typically inform the authorities that's happened? Because it seems to me that if the authorities were aware of it beforehand, there may be some intervention that happens beforehand. I'll let you respond to that.
You're referring to law enforcement?
Yes, law enforcement or county mental health.
I think that in most cases, they would notify their campus police that the student was expelled. I think that as far as law enforcement being notified, whatever local jurisdiction is there, it would depend on what else accompanied that. Was there were there threats made? Was there some sort of crime committed by that person for the reason that they were expelled? I think in that case, law enforcement would probably be notified or at least be aware.
Okay, great, thank you.
So Val, back to your question though, I mean, silence, and as Dr. Faith was saying, silence is more the rule than the exception. I mean, look at domestic violence. Domestic violence goes on with underreporting or non-reporting very, very often. And I think, Dr. Faith elucidated some of the reasons why children and adolescents don't talk about bullying, because mostly it's among friends and all the consequences that occur. So as parents and as professionals, we have to talk about, we have to help immunize, if you will, our children against that code of silence that just perpetuates that system. But I would say it's more endemic to human nature, if you will.
We have time for one more question. Right over here.
Hi, I'm from Pinellas County Schools, and I just wanted to share with the room and hearing some of the things that we've heard. We have actually recently partnered with the Sandy Hook Promise organization, and we have 2 programs that we're bringing into the school district. One of them is called Start with Hello, and it's a program where you get to know your classmates. And the other program, and I want to make sure I get this right, is the Say Something program. And so it basically looks at some of the warning signs and the symptoms and how to report. And another piece of the organization is actually an anonymous tip line, and it's an app that all of our students are going to have access to. So that's coming, and that actually started prior to everything that happened with Parkland. So we already have things in the works.
One more in the back.
Yeah. I want to thank you for tonight because I have been very anxious. I'm a school nurse. I've been in and out of multiple schools. I have a son who attends a different school, and for the weekend I was looking forward to relaxing with him. I wanted to see school nurse.
One of my son's teachers had assigned an assignment, which was write a 4-paragraph paper about how you would prevent school shootings. So our whole weekend was, I was looking forward to relaxing again, but it was around doing that. And then we arrived at his high school today, and they had changed the entrance, barricaded it off, and had a whole new entrance. With bookshelves. It was like going into the room of requirement in Harry Potter, with the crazy stuff in there. So it was a little anxiety-provoking. I have to tell you that tonight really helped me, and I'm looking forward to going home and talking to him more, because the first thing when I picked him up from school today was, why is that door like that? And he has medical issues, and he has some health needs. So it just made him a little bit more anxious as well. So I really thank you for tonight, because it really helped me. Yeah.
And thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for your participation. Thank you to our panel of experts. Michelle, is there anything that you want to say to wrap up?
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.